Don Gordon. Bueno, buenos días a todos. Vamos a iniciar esta presentación del informe de renovables del año 2017 de la Agencia Internacional, que como sabéis se publicó en octubre. Vamos a cambiar a inglés, ¿no? We are going to switch to English because Mr. Bahar, who is coming to present this presentation, he speaks English, no, and French, and nearly he will speak Spanish, no? Nearly, I think so. Okay, this is the second time we are presenting this renewables report. I think this year we presented the Club report, and now is the second one. He was put out in September last year or in October last year. And this is the good relationship we have with International Energy Agents, which produced this collaboration. And Mr. Bahar is the second time he came here to present this renewable report. Last year was a good year for the renewables. This is as you will see after this in their presentation, and this is in this new report they will include all the relation with renewables in heat and transport and other parts of this, as you can see in the presentation of Mr. Bahar. I would like to thank Mr. Bahar for coming. He is Turkish. He is a PhD in Johns Hopkins too, and he worked for OECD. He worked for another international bodies, and he joined the International Energy Agency 3 years ago, 5 years ago. 5 years ago. Now he's responsible with Mr. Paolo Frankel, who came last year here to develop this medium-term report about renewables. I give the floor to Mr. Bahar now.
Thank you.
Let me put here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for attending too many people. We launched this report in October last year in London, and after that we have been doing several presentations all around the world to basically share the key findings of this report. I will present about 12 slides. It will be about half an hour, then we will open for questions and answers. Some of the things that I'm going to present has already changed. We are updating our forecast, so it's a very dynamic market, but I'll point out what I think it will change in the next year to you as well. So I'd like to start with a context. There are 3 important numbers that I would like to start with, which represent 3 core challenges of our energy world. The first number is 6.5. Globally, around 6.5 million people die because of air pollution. This is our analysis 2 years ago, mostly in the emerging economies such as China, India, where the coal is prominent, but it's a global problem. The second one, if all countries implement their national determined plans that they submitted in Paris 2 years ago, the world will warm up by 2.7 degrees. So it's far away from the 2-degree scenario. So that plan needs to be more ambitious. The third number is 1.2. 1.2 billion people do not have energy access, electricity access globally. Even more so, do not have access to clean cooking facilities. This is also an important challenge that we need to face. And renewables obviously contribute to tackling all of these challenges. And my presentation will basically show you how renewables are moving in the coming 5 years. And we can have a discussion how they can address these challenges in the coming 5 years. I'd like to start in 2016. Now we are in 2018. It seems very old, but IEA collects and gathers data in a very long process. So a record deployment of renewables happened in 2016. Renewables overall was about 165 gigawatts of new capacity, which represented 2/3 of the global net capacity additions, which means plants, power plants. So last year, this was 50%. When we presented in 2015, this report, we said that they represented 50%. Coal, in terms of all additions, is the first fuel. However, when you take into account retirements of coal plants globally, solar PV is the first fuel in terms of global capacity additions in 2016. We are talking about capacity additions here, not generation. I will talk about it later. But overall, this is a step change. Why I say step change? For the first time, solar PV became the first fuel in terms of capacity growth among all renewables. And it is the first time a renewable technology became the first fuel among all our energy system in terms of capacity additions. So we call this as a step change. Just to give you a hint about 2017, 2016 deployment was driven by China because China installed alone 33 gigawatts. The first numbers show that China in 2017 installed 55 gigawatts. So we are talking about this number to increase again significantly. There are two important drivers that drive renewable capacity growth globally. The first one is policies. We have still a lot of policies, but the way that governments implement policies or introduce policies are changing. In 2016, we looked at all power plants that are deployed and what were their remuneration level, what policy has driven them, which means who decides the price to give to those renewable plants. And we figured out that only 20% of this was competitively set. The rest was basically feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs that the governments, we call them administratively set prices, that the government set it. But this picture will change in the coming 5 years. We expect the capacity growth of renewables that will come in the coming 5 years to be about almost 50% to come from competitively set pricing. So there is a new trend globally, which is also implemented right now in Spain as well and all around Europe. Renewable policies are moving from feed-in tariffs to renewable auctions or competitive systems. And we will see this trend globally in this picture. If you exclude China, which is still a big feed-in tariff market, we actually expect almost 70% or two-thirds of the new capacity, renewable capacity coming online, coming from competitively set prices. Just want to clarify, they are not competitive. Their prices will be competitively set. This is the policy change. The second one, which is a result of this, these dots gives you the average of all auctions that are announced by commissioning date. That's why they go further. So we basically collect every single auction that is announced globally and weighted average them and come up with this graph. As you can see, the plants that are coming online in 2020, for the first time, on average, solar PV plants will give lower price than wind, onshore wind, which is an important development. But these are just the announced auction prices. Obviously, we have to be careful with this because we do not know if they will be delivered on time. We do not know if they will be delivered on the price. These are just the announcements. We have a global levelized cost of energy index that we produce. We basically take all our existing capacity, all the cost models we have, and all the future capacity with the cost reductions. The picture looks a little bit different. But the reason why the picture looks different is because of three main markets, which are much higher than auction prices, because of three main markets. The first one is Japan, which is a big solar PV market and very, very expensive. The second one is China, which is relatively expensive compared to auction prices because it's a large feed-in tariff market. And also United States, which is still very expensive in terms of system costs. We will see another technology coming up, offshore wind. European results show it's very prominent in terms of the recent auction results in Netherlands, UK, and Germany. We will see the offshore wind average generation cost to decline by 30 to 35% in the coming 5 years. Let's look at the forecast in terms of by technology. Because solar PV enters a new era, because what I described previously, because of the 2016 trend, what is coming in the future. We expect about 922 gigawatts of new renewable capacity to come online in the coming 5 years. And you see the picture on the last column about almost 45% or 50% is coming from solar PV alone. It's the largest, basically, growth market. Another important trend to follow, the impact of hydropower, as you can see. The hydropower growth is reduced over time. Hydropower was between 1999 and 2004, in terms of capacity addition, largest. Now it's becoming basically a smaller share of the renewable capacity growth going forward. This trend is driven by China, as the sites are becoming more expensive, social and economic factors are becoming more important in order to deploy new large-scale hydropower plant. You will see this shrinking. We also do an accelerated case. In our main case, we basically look at drivers, costs, targets, policies, and challenges. And in the accelerated case, we say, if those challenges are met in 24 months in these countries, what we can see in the renewable market. And our forecast is about quarter higher than the main case, mostly driven by China and, again, solar PV. And there are basically 3 important challenges that we see in every single country. The one is still policy and regulatory uncertainties. The second one is the grid integration challenges in both OECD and non-OECD countries. Grid integration challenges, I mean both the integration of renewables into the system, also the grid connection availabilities in many markets. And the third one is affordable financing. This is mostly in developing countries. There's a huge potential in Africa and Middle East. However, it's right now difficult to tap because of the high cost of financing. One important point, close to 85% of new capacity additions will come just wind and solar, which means just variable technologies. 80% of what we will see coming up, both in accelerated and main cases, are from just wind and solar. So we cannot talk about a success of overall renewables. We can talk about a pure success of wind and solar in this case, because they represent the majority. Of course, this will have integration challenges, which I will present later on. When we look at the picture by country, obviously China is leading the way. It's undisputed leader. China represents 42% of all renewable capacity additions globally, followed by, this is past 5 years, by the way. So you can see the picture was like China first, EU second, followed by US, Japan, and India, and the rest. The picture in the coming 5 years will change. China remaining the leader. US, despite all the uncertainties, at the time we did the forecast, which means before the tax reform and before the solar PV import tariffs that are implemented. So US picture may change. We can discuss this in the Q&A session, but still remains in the second country in terms of forecast. One important change in the picture is India surpassing European Union in terms of capacity growth. There are important drivers in India. Renewable costs are basically decreasing very fast, especially solar PV. There is a perception change in India, because it used to be that the utilities were thinking that we can't basically buy renewables because they're expensive. But after the auction results in the last 2 years, they realized that actually in some states, solar PV auction results are lower than coal tariffs in certain states. So the perception has already changed, and now we will have other challenges coming up in terms of grid and stuff, but overall we see an important perception change in India, which drives our forecast. We also have an accelerated forecast for each country as per technology, and accelerated case is much larger in China, because China still has 2 important challenges. The first one is obviously curtailment and grid integration, and the second one is renewables are still expensive, and the budget to pay for renewables, the surcharge pay for renewables, is eroding very fast, and there are payment delays to Chinese developers, and China is changing its policy from feed-in tariff system to a green certificate, which we do not know exactly when is going to happen. That large accelerated case reflects this policy uncertainty. We talked about PV, we talked about China. Now put them together, we have a PV market which is a little bit complicated. So this is the share of China in total PV manufacturing globally. As of 2016, China represented 50% of all global PV manufacturing. When you include Chinese companies' investments outside of China, such as Philippines, Malaysia, and few other Southeast Asian countries, this numbers goes up to 66, 70%. As of 2017, we are talking about even much larger number. However, this is not a big news. This, as you can see, the line is flat since 2011. What has changed in 2016 and will continue to be like this is the red line, which means China's share in global demand. So it used to be that China was an export market. Now China is also the demand. So we are talking about, for a global solar PV market, a single country representing probably as of 2017, 60% of the demand and 60% even more of the supply. So it may be the case that China maybe actually imported solar panels this year because of the 55 gigawatt that it installed with the export requirements that they had. So we are talking about the PV market which is actually changing very fast that everyone was expecting, especially those who were planning on putting the tariffs to China and all the other basically talks about the anti-dumping. It will change. The dynamics will change because China is changing. China is now both the demand and supply. We also looked at for the first time an off-grid market and looked at the three main segments of the off-grid market. The first one is SHC, we call is the solar home system, which means a system which has a small panel, a battery, which people can charge their, can light few light bulbs and charge their phones. This is in Africa and Southeast Asia. We looked at the industrial applications such as mining or basically hospitals or commercial applications. Let's put it, they run on diesel generator and they are basically changing to solar PV to decrease their fuel costs. We also have mini grids, which are basically mostly in Africa and Southeast Asia. So we expect a significant growth in terms of capacity, although they remain very small. They remain about 3 gigawatt growth versus 922 overall renewables in the coming 5 years. But one important point is that although the numbers are small, their impact is very large in terms of the economic development in these countries. So we expect basically about 70 million people in just 5 years to gain access electricity only through these small home systems. We estimated only that because estimating the rest is much more difficult. So we estimated how many people will gain initial electricity access from these small home systems. It's about 70 million people, and probably we will revise this up this year. We talked about capacity. That's the generation picture. These are the three main fuels: coal, natural gas, and nuclear. Their development over the coming 5 years. Coal will continue increasing, unfortunately, in our main case. Carlos presented here. And you will see that actually in 2017, if you saw the China electricity demand growth numbers, which was about 7%. Last year in 2016 was 2.5%. If Chinese electricity demand is growing that fast, which means coal is growing globally. So coal generation will grow in China, which means it will grow globally. We will see how CO2 emissions that we release every March, how this will be affected, because we have been announcing that they've been flat over the last 2 years. We will see in 2017 what's going to happen to CO2 emissions, maybe driven by China. So this part is probably true, 2017 part, and it depends on China's economic growth. We will see how the coal and other ASEAN countries. So renewables are obviously leading the way. It's just below coal in 2022. The gap between coal and renewables are closing very fast. This gap is only 17% here, and this is our main case. In the accelerated case, the gap will be even lower than this. And the share of renewables in the global picture will grow from 24% in 2016 to 13% in 2022. Obviously, the share of renewables are growing, but the share of wind and solar, which means variable technologies, are growing faster. These are the few key countries, as you can see. This is the share of wind and solar in 2016, and this is the growth in 2022. So as you can see, countries like Denmark are reaching 70% of their generation just coming from wind and solar alone, and mostly wind. And a few European countries follow, Ireland, Spain, Germany, United Kingdom, to be very close to 30%. This is annual generation. As you can see at the hourly level, this can be much higher. And the only way that Denmark is basically dealing with this, will deal with 70%, because it's super well connected to the rest of the Europe. And it's Denmark, we cannot talk about Denmark as an only country, because it's very well connected. However, another important thing, although it might look very small, in China, India, Brazil, and US, quickly in just 5 years, we will see from 5 to 10% share of variable renewables growing. It might sound small, but for these countries, it's actually big for certain regions. So we will have to find a way to integrate renewables in a cost-effective way. IEA is in the opinion that integration is not a technical issue, it's a cost issue. You can integrate renewables in a very costly way, you can integrate in a cost-effective way. We need to find the right balance to basically talk about the cost of integration and how do we integrate that. For the first time, we looked at the electric cars and their share of renewable consumption. We estimated their share of renewable consumption. So everyone talks about Tesla and all the electric cars. However, they represent only 5% of global electricity consumption of all electric vehicles. As you can see, 2 3-wheelers and buses are much larger than them. Especially in China, there are millions and millions and millions of 2 3-wheelers electric, because the government banned to use diesel or gasoline motorbikes in Beijing and Shanghai in certain areas, so they have to buy electric. So consumption is driven by that. Currently, we estimate that renewable consumption of electric cars are about 25%. Everyone thinks that electric cars equals renewables, which is not the case. The majority of the rest are coming from coal globally and gas, mostly fossil fuels. Their consumption will double in just 5 years, all electric vehicles, and you can see the penetration of electric cars are increasing with electric buses, but the growth still is driven by the 2 3-wheelers. In 2022, we will see their share, with the share of renewables increasing, to reach 30%. Obviously, electric cars are important, but when we look at the renewable transport as a whole, they are very small compared to biofuels. Biofuels still remain the largest renewables in the transport sector. They represent 96% of all renewables consumed in the transport. In 2022, this picture will change only slightly. The share of electric vehicles will increase to 7%, but it remains that biofuels is the driver of the growth. One important point here, this is by energy consumption. Obviously, electric motors are more efficient, and in terms of the input versus how many kilometers they do, they are much more efficient. This picture is actually a little bit misleading. It will be much larger if we were to calculate this in terms of the per kilometers driven. So, but not that much. The picture remains the same. One note on heat. Everyone is talking about electricity, but heat is actually the biggest giant in the room, which we are not trying to address, heating and cooling. European Union maybe is not doing very well on the electricity side, doing quite well on the transport side, but doing much better on the heat side because of policies. This is an area where policies are limited. This is an area where it's difficult to decarbonize heat because of two main reasons. On the industrial side, It's difficult because there are so many different applications, so many different temperature requirements. Some renewables cannot meet those requirements already, technically. And on the building side, it's about behavioral economics. It's consumer choice. Sometimes if your gas boiler is broken, you don't do the cost analysis at home to figure out, should I buy a biomass boiler? You just go and replace it very quickly because you needed some technology that you know, some technology that you can replace very quickly. So these are the challenges that heat sector is facing. But overall, European Union leads in terms of the share of renewables in heat. It reaches about 22 to 23%, followed by United States. Actually, India's share in renewables in heat is declining because renewable consumption cannot keep up with growing demand. China is basically at the end of the picture right now, but even with this share growth, it represents the absolute leader of the renewables and heating sector, and we expect slowly its share to grow to 5%. One comparison to look at the European Union in these three sectors and share of renewables. This is global share, renewable electricity 30%, heat 11%, and transport only 4% of renewables. Actually, European Union is doing well above the global averages in this case because of the achievements that it did over the last, I would say, 15 years. Its share is much larger than global averages right now. Obviously, we can discuss 2030 targets and how they will be implemented in the Q&A section, but this is the picture in 2020 still that the European Union will lead. Few concluding remarks. So we expect between main and accelerated case 1 terawatt of renewables coming online in just 5 years. This is equals to the global cumulative installed coal capacity since 1920s, just to give you an idea. Renewable generation exceeds 8,000 terawatt hours, and this is equals to the electricity consumption of China, India, and Germany combined. So we are talking about a significant chunk coming from renewables. Solar PV enters into a new era. It will be the leading source of growth in terms of capacity, both in our 5-year outlook, but also in the World Energy Outlook's scenario. It's the leading fuel by far. And in terms of generation growth, not the absolute generation, it also leads to both the forecast and the long-term scenario. However, we have to be careful here with China's influence and how the market will change in the coming years. I think 2018 is very, very important to see how prices will develop. Despite rapid growth of electric vehicles, decarbonization of transport is really, really slow. We need to basically look at two giant sectors of growth, which are aviation and marine shipping, which are mostly running on one in aviation fuels, jet fuel, the other one is bunker, both fossil fuels. Advanced biofuels require specific policies to make the bridge the cost gap, and we need to turn our attention, not we, but policymakers, if there are any here in this room, our attention on heating and cooling, if you want to decarbonize and move to the 2-degree scenario. Thank you very much for listening. And that's
Thank you very much, Heymi, for this bright presentation about the bright future you are forecasting for the renewables. No? A little bit different with electricity than heat and transport. No? Well, this you can see this presentation on our web. I think after this now is uploading there in the web. No? And this is the time for question and answer from this area. You would like to comment something more about the USA's policy? After this, we will give the floor to.
Sure. So
because you asked me before.
Yes. So US. So as I said, there are two important policy changes in the United States. One is the tariffs that Trump administration put on the solar PV panels. US is the second largest solar PV market in terms of demand. The picture is actually, in terms of the supply and demand, is very clear. US solar PV market is 12 to 14 gigawatts. US solar PV production is 1 gigawatt. So the picture, I mean, US imports about 90 to 95% of its solar PV needs. Obviously, in the short term, this will increase the prices. But when we look at a little bit of more detail, there are a few important things to know. The first one is that the tariff is only put on crystalline panels, not thin film. So, which means that thin film panels are excluded from the tariff. How much thin film capacity exists in the world that can be possibly exported to US? It's about 6 to 7 gigawatts. Okay, this is optimistic that it will be an immediate export market because it will be competitive, certainly, because it's not part of the tariffs. So, another important thing is that few countries, large countries, are not included, which are producing solar PV panels. One is Turkey, the other one is Brazil. Like, their production is very small right now, but these are big countries, and India. So obviously, in these countries, they are net importer of solar PV panels. But if you remember, when European Union put tariffs against Chinese panels, what happened? Chinese manufacturers moved extremely fast their manufacturing plants to in Southeast Asia and started to export from there. So I'm not saying that this will happen again, but there is a chance that this may happen, and then price increase in the US market may be small. On the other side of the picture, US manufacturers are starting to increase their prices because they know that they have a premium, and they will start increasing the prices. So we will analyze this year in the new report how this will balance out, because there's also a lot of cost reduction potential that will come on. This is the tariff picture that everyone is trying to understand. The tax reform is good for existing plants because existing plants will have more profits because their tax will be reduced. However, for new plants, the picture is more complicated. For new plants, the tax equity, which is the main driver of the US market, will be reduced because the base that you can monetize all these tax credits will be lower. However, we trust that smart financial industry of the United States will find ways to go around this, but what we can expect initially that the cost of capital will rise slightly, but this also depends on the various factors. Again, we will analyze this in the next report. Yeah.
Report.
Yeah.
Okay, questions or at the end? You can introduce yourself and put the question.
David Robinson, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. You mentioned that 30% of the renewable capacity was being, if you want, currently acquired through competitive processes such as auctions. But you also stressed that that was not a competitive market. So the assumption is, now anyway, and if it's 70%, it's still going to be through auctions of that kind, that governments are going to be deciding most of the what will be built and when. Given the existence of competitive markets today, which, many of which are energy-only markets, I wonder whether the IEA has any views on whether it's feasible to imagine governments no longer in future being responsible for making these decisions, and for markets to be reformed in such a way that that they alone are able to, if you want, to motivate if you want, investment in renewables. To what extent is the existing market, which was designed for a different form of capacity, you know what I mean, fossil fuel-based capacity, is it ready to provide the right incentives for investment without governments effectively having to force it in through auctions?
The quick answer is no to this. So the markets are changing very fast, And we are, our energy-only markets are basically designed on marginal cost basis, right, for fossil fuels. So you bid into a market, it's a competitive market, you have a marginal cost, which is fossil fuel, and when you enter, when you put all these, even you subsidize or you don't subsidize, all these zero marginal cost wind and solar into the market, obviously it has a, it's not the same technology, right? So there are significant changes in the market. So the policy design of the future, let's say the feed-in tariffs were policy 1.0. The auction schemes to introduce competition within renewables, I will say, is 2.0. The policy 3.0 probably will be a combination of the long-term contracts for maybe everyone, but if you want to decarbonize mostly for renewables, because you need some kind of an incentive for these capital-intensive technologies to enter into the market. Otherwise, they will never be built. Despite their costs are coming down, it's a heavy lifting in the beginning. You need to invest all your money, then operational costs are close to zero afterwards. I mean, it's not zero, but it's very minimal. So you need to find the market design that basically looks at this, but at the same time gives short-term price signals for integration. And obviously in the future, carbon price for fossil fuels. So a long-term contract system to make sure that you attract necessary investments into the energy markets. A short-term market which will basically do the balancing and give the price the value of the generation. Not only megawatt hours or gigawatt hours, whatever they exist, but to basically have a value, proper value to the system. Does this market exist? Not yet. Is anyone working on this? Yes. European Union market design is working towards that direction. The best example that I know is the Mexico new energy market reform, which is very, very interesting. The auction system, green certificate auction system, combined with a short-term market, locational and hourly premiums. So this is right now one of the most, I would say, new markets that is liberalized just 2 years ago, and which is very interesting to look at. We do not know if it's, I can't say that it's successful, but in terms of design perspective, it takes into account what I just said.
Any questions? No? Here we have two here. Feliz.
Well, first of all,
After this.
congratulations on your very good report, very interesting. One question is that in general, renewables, particularly wind and solar photovoltaics, are intensive in capital. How do you think that in 5 years the trend for raising rates may affect the progress in penetration? The second question is, when you talk about the growing, increasing penetration, the numbers that go around, generally, particularly in the case of solar, are excluding the cost of grid integration. How do you think that when you feed in the cost of grid integration, this may affect penetration? And the last one is if you could elaborate a little bit more on China abandoning the feed-in tariffs and what are the alternatives. Thank you.
Maybe we can collect another one from.
Sure, of course.
Introduce yourself.
Yes.
Feliz. It's not working.
From India Energy Institute. I want to ask you about the share of just burning biomass in the heating renewables capacity increase, and also if you have any forecast on cooling.
Cooling, okay. Yes. So, in terms of the raising capital, where is the if this capital exists? All the financial sector thinks that the capital is there. We just need to find the right policies and incentives to channel it through. So this is maybe the second largest challenge in our forecast. affordable financing. Obviously, we have gone through a very nice period of low interest rate financing globally, especially in developed countries. Let's be honest, this helped a lot, this huge investment and record level investments that are coming through the market. However, we don't know exactly how this will change, right, in the coming few years. It seems that they will remain low interest rates, so this is a good news. I'm talking about in the coming 5 years, unless we have another global financial crisis, probably not, hopefully. So that's the first one. In terms of raising the capital, the missing part is that renewables still are considered, can be considered as a risky investment. These contract prices, these auction schemes, help them a lot because it gives them a nice visibility of the investment. And that's why auctions is a good way for renewables to come to the market and achieve low premiums for investment. However, there is also an important change in terms of the governments. If you introduce an auction, you do more work as a government than feed-in tariff. Let's face this. So because all the auctions require an important design mechanism depending on the technology or depending on the location, right? So, and the successes show that when government puts more effort into the designing the auction to understanding the risks and addressing them, such as offshore wind auctions in many markets in Europe, which is a good example, it actually gives a lot of good flavor in terms of the decreasing the premiums. The biggest giant in the market is Africa. How we can attract investment in Africa still has larger premiums. There's a lot of products, I would say insurance products, and are being developed right now, bonds and certain things which are growing very fast. I think these diversification of financial products addressing renewable challenges is another trend that we will see in the coming 5 years and will help renewables to be work. The second one is penetration of the value. Obviously, when solar PV enters during the day into a market, it basically decreases its own value more than wind. So it's basically shooting itself onto the foot, basically, if you have more solar PV. So that's why there needs to be a combination of market design to address these issues. I think the government should think about, let's just not build wherever and whenever these plants are located. We need to think about more at a system level. Like in, again, a Mexico example. There's a premium to build certain plants in certain areas. And their generation over the coming 15 years has also a premium, depending on the price factors of that region, the nodal pricing points, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, a holistic approach is required in terms of addressing this. China feed-in tariff, very expensive right now. When I show the prices, auction prices, which are around $30 to $50 per megawatt hour, Chinese feed-in tariff is around 80, 90. So there's a lot of curtailment in China. Many people think that the reason why the feed-in tariff is so high because the curtailment is so risky that it's kind of a premium, because the average curtailment of wind plants last year was about 15%. So we are talking about a risk which is not compensated. High feed-in tariff somehow addresses to that. They would like to introduce green certificate system. They are introducing regional markets, electricity markets, and they would like to include a green certificate system with a quota at the provincial level in order to basically cheaply support renewables. But this will take time. The transition scheduled to happen this year, but my personal opinion, it's not going to happen this year. It will happen more in 2019, 2020, and there will be a gradual decrease of feed-in tariffs and transition to auctions. Heating and cooling. Bioenergy is by far the largest renewable technology in the heating sector. In terms of both buildings and industry, it represents, I think, if I remember correctly, it's about 70% of all heating and cooling. The rest is geothermal, solar thermal, solar thermal, and renewable share of heat pumps, obviously. That's also the part. In our forecast, it remains also the largest growth, biomass, because bioenergy is the only renewable technology that can meet most of the technical requirements, because solar thermal has a certain limit in terms of meeting temperature, high temperature requirements. Biomass can do that. Obviously, there are limits on that, how much you can increase the boiler, so on and so forth, depending on your design. But overall, biomass is the largest growth market. Cooling, we don't have right now, at least. There will be a new report that will be released on cooling from the IEA, I think in 2018, so I'll recommend to watch that one. It's coming up, yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? At the end.
Yeah, good morning. This is Luis Crespo from Protermo Solar. I would like to ask you whether, zooming a little bit more in the projections you have already made for annual consumption or annual contribution, whether you feel that such a huge contribution of non-dispatchable technologies is sustainable from the point of view of curtailments, from the point of view of capture price in marginal markets, and also from the point of view of responding to demand needs when the retirements of backup is going to take place. And secondly, whether in your analysis you have already considered that in the recent tenders in many sunny countries, CSP with storage has been competitive and has won tenders against combined cycles, gas combined cycles. Don't you think that, the long view I've already seen some projections of the International Agency where you putting photovoltaic in the center of the day and putting also CSP with the storage along the night and also after the evening peak could really have a big chance of being really large contributors in the demand. So I don't see CSP already in your projections. That's why I ask you. Okay, thank you.
Sure. We do CSP projections. Unfortunately, because of time limit, I did not present here. Everything is in the book. I can talk a little bit about it. We have a full CSP database that we collect every single project by their storage abilities, and we do our forecast based on that. Although the numbers are small compared to big solar PV and wind, it's the third technology, I will say, third and fourth, like offshore wind and CSP, which are the two technologies that we see coming to the market faster than before. And the trend shows that the storage hours will increase. They will be more part of the picture, especially in Middle East and African countries, and Chile, in certain parts of Chile. And then we see that the storage hours are reaching 8 to 12 hours in the coming 5 years. There was a figure, but I didn't put it here. We draw all the projects we have and then how storage abilities increase. So it will be part of the picture. The recent tenders in certain areas are $70 per USD, which is half the price 3 years ago, which is an incredible development. And we will see more, I think, standardized, standardized meaning that every CSP plant is different, but the same company that is basically achieve this low price will continue to deploy this technology in the coming future. That's the CSP part. The limit on the, so I'm talking about the solar PV and wind, and I gave a few examples, but solar PV represents today's electricity generation only 1.5%, okay? Let's be a little bit frank here. And wind is about 7%. Over the forecast period, bioenergy, a dispatchable technology from electricity, is much larger than this. Already it's about 8%, and it will grow. And we are talking about dispatchable renewables as their capacity factors are much higher than wind and solar. They will be part of the picture. In this analysis, we do not do an hourly dispatching of the global model. Our system integration unit who is doing very specific country examples. They are working on Thailand right now to basically figure out what are the hotspots for the issues. Here we look at in this report we look at as a challenge to deployment, not in terms of generation, actual generation. So I think I cannot answer directly the technical limits of renewables in this, at least part of in the coming 5 years.
Okay, the last one, the last one you can from me, for instance. Are you forecasting in the IEA to continue the drop in the prices of the PV solar after 2022, I think is the... and what about the bio second generation in the transport?
So, for solar PV prices will continue to decline in two parts. The first part is modules. So modules represent, by the way, around 30% of a system. So everyone talks about modules, but it's not like a wind turbine, which can represent 70 to 80% of a system, while modules represent sometimes 10% of a system, depending on the location. So this differentiation is important. We expect solar PV module prices to decline, although it's very difficult to forecast in this China demand situation. So especially after what happened after the tariffs. So we will try to figure out this year how the prices, but our price projections from last year will continue to decline about 20% more. It's today levels, global average. That's the trend that we're seeing. On the balance of system cost, which means non-module costs, there is a lot of more potential for cost reduction, especially in high-cost countries such as United States, such as United States and Japan. Europe is a very good example of this, the decreasing balance of system costs. One of the lowest balance of system costs globally are in European countries, believe it or not. Germany is the most efficient, one of the most efficient countries in terms of balance of system costs, achieving that. And I think world needs to learn a little bit more about how we can lift the barriers in terms of the balance of system costs. The other one was on advanced biofuels. Yeah, advanced biofuels. So advanced biofuels represent right now, if I'm not mistaken, only 2% of the global biofuels production. There are a lot of plants. I wouldn't call them demonstration plants, but there are a lot of operational plants. Right now, they're operating at a lower level. So why? Because there are certain technical issues, in one sense. Low oil prices did not help, because we estimate that for lower bound advanced biofuels, the break-even point with the oil price is about $100 to $120. So 3 years ago, it was okay. Right now, it's not okay at all. So when the gap increases, obviously the support needs to improve. But one important thing to mention, there is no other ways to decarbonize transport right now. So that's you need advanced biofuels, because with conventional biofuels, this is not going to happen, because you need to, when we are talking about aviation and maritime shipping, when you go beyond cars, when you go to long-haul transport, the picture completely changes. And you need much more production, and this can only happen through advanced biofuels. Conventional biofuels, in the end, they are food crops. So that's why we need more actually policy support to get the cost down of advanced biofuels. And this can be in various ways, but I think it should be one of the policy attention, because without that, I don't see in any close future planes running on electric batteries crossing Atlantic. It will be quite tough, at least in the coming 10 years, I will say. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Heymi, for coming here. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much.
We give again applause.